Welcome. Thank you for being here today. We're diving into a powerful story from the Old Testament, one that reveals just how quickly people can fall from divine encounter to devastating rebellion. If you enjoy deep, thoughtful videos like this, be sure to subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. It really helps us grow and share these messages with more people. Freedom had just begun. After generations of oppression in Egypt, the Israelites walked into the wilderness not as captives, but as a chosen people. Their deliverance had been nothing short of miraculous. Waters had parted, armies had fallen, and God Himself had led them in a pillar of cloud and fire. No other nation had seen such wonders. And now they stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, a place where the Creator of heaven and earth chose to draw near. What happened on that mountain was unlike anything before. Thunder roared. Fire descended. Smoke covered the summit. The ground trembled beneath their feet as God spoke, not in whispers, not through intermediaries, but in a voice so overwhelming that the people begged Moses to speak on their behalf. This was not religion by tradition. This was encounter. They saw the holy and heard the divine, and they vowed with trembling hearts to obey all that the Lord had said. But even as they made that promise, something fragile stirred beneath the surface. Their bodies had left Egypt, but their minds had not yet been renewed. Fear still clung to them. Doubt still whispered in the silence. They were free, but they did not yet know how to live free. And in the waiting, in the quiet space between promise and fulfillment, their hearts would be tested. While Moses remained on the mountain, receiving sacred instruction from God, the people below began to shift. The absence of their leader felt like abandonment. The silence felt like distance. They forgot the fire. They forgot the voice. What had started in awe began to wither into uncertainty. And when people feel uncertain, they often reach for what they can control. This moment was meant to be the birth of a holy nation. Instead, it became the stage for one of the greatest spiritual collapses in all of Scripture. Not because God failed them, but because they turned from Him when He felt far. The golden calf was not simply a mistake. It was a revelation of what still lived in their hearts. While Moses was still enveloped by the cloud atop Mount Sinai, receiving divine instructions in the presence of unapproachable glory, the mood in the camp below began to shift. At first, the awe of what they had witnessed held the people in a kind of sacred stillness. The mountain, wrapped in smoke and thunder, reminded them that God was not to be taken lightly. But days passed, and then more days, and the sense of immediacy began to wane. The sounds from the summit grew fainter. The pillar of cloud remained, but Moses did not return. Silence stretched across the days like a heavy curtain. The initial wonder gave way to uncertainty, and from uncertainty grew unrest. The people had come to rely on Moses as their visible connection to the invisible God. He was their leader, their prophet, the one who spoke to God on their behalf. Without Him, they felt exposed, directionless, vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, the voice of fear began to grow louder. What if Moses was dead? What if he had been consumed by the fire on the mountain? What if he had abandoned them? These questions, whispered at first, soon echoed throughout the camp. Faith requires endurance. It asks for trust even when answers are delayed, even when the path is unclear. But endurance was not something they had practiced. Their history was one of immediate needs and immediate deliverance. Manna fell every morning. Water came when they cried out. Battles were won before they raised a sword. Now, with no sign of Moses and no fresh word from God, the quiet became intolerable. Silence, for those not rooted in faith, often feels like abandonment. Impatience began to blur their memory. The thunderous voice that had once made them tremble now seemed distant. The commandments they had heard with their own ears faded into something abstract. Without Moses, the covenant felt suspended, as if their connection to God had been cut. They did not understand that silence from above did not mean absence. They did not realize that waiting was not punishment, but preparation. Instead, they felt forgotten. And when people feel forgotten, They grasped for control. They went to Aaron not as a priest to be consulted in reverence, but as a figure to be manipulated. Their request was clear, even if it came cloaked in confusion. Make us gods who shall go before us. They wanted something they could see, something they could touch. The cloud was too mysterious. The voice from heaven too overwhelming. They craved familiarity, something that resembled the idols of Egypt, not the uncontainable God of Sinai. Though they had been rescued from Pharaoh, the spiritual habits of Egypt still lingered in their bones. Their demand was not just a moment of weakness. It was the result of fear left unchecked, of trust allowed to decay. They were not simply bored or impatient, they were unraveling. Emotionally, they were caught between awe and anxiety. Spiritually, they were suspended between revelation and rebellion. And instead of pressing into the discomfort with faith, they surrendered to it. They chose to anchor their hope in something tangible, even if it meant betraying the very God who had delivered them. At that moment, they stopped being a people of promise and began to act like a people of panic. And Aaron, who should have stood firm, who should have reminded them of what they had seen and heard, was swept up in the same current of fear. But that is a matter for another chapter. For now, what matters is understanding how a people so recently touched by divine glory could fall so quickly into darkness. It was not a sudden collapse, it was a slow erosion. Each day of silence chipped away at their confidence. Each unanswered question made room for doubt. They forgot that faith is forged in the waiting. Instead, they allowed fear to shape their decisions. And fear, once it becomes the loudest voice, does not lead people to wisdom. It leads them to desperation. And desperation, when it turns away from trust, becomes fertile ground for idolatry. The choice Aaron made that day cannot be explained by pressure alone. The people may have come to him demanding a God, but the weight of leadership was his to bear. This was the same Aaron who had stood beside Moses in Egypt, who had spoken on his brother's behalf before Pharaoh, who had witnessed the plagues, crossed the Red Sea, eaten the manna. He had seen what divine power could do. He had heard the voice of God and felt the weight of his presence. And yet, when the crowd surged toward him, anxious and determined, something inside him gave way. It was not that Aaron did not know the truth. It was that he chose to set it aside. Perhaps he feared the people would turn on him next. Perhaps he told himself that giving them what they wanted would calm the situation, buy some time, restore order. But obedience to fear often disguises itself as practical wisdom. In truth, it is always compromise. Instead of calling the people back to their senses, Aaron asked for their gold. The irony is striking. The very gold they had received as a sign of God's favor, the wealth of Egypt handed to them in a miraculous act of divine justice, became the material for rebellion. It should have been used for worship, for the tabernacle, for the service of God. Instead, it was melted down and recast into a shape familiar to Egypt, a calf, a symbol of strength and fertility, a creature to be admired but never worshipped. Aaron fashioned it with his own hands, not by accident, not in haste. The text is clear. He received the gold, fashioned it with a graving tool, and made a molded calf. This was a deliberate act. He did not resist. He participated. Then, perhaps in an attempt to mask the idolatry, he built an altar before the calf and proclaimed a feast to the Lord. It was a stunning contradiction, a blending of holy and profane. He tried to merge the worship of the one true God with the image of a false god, as if sincerity could cleanse disobedience, as if the people could direct their praise to Yahweh through an object he had forbidden. This was more than a lapse in judgment. It was a theological disaster. Aaron's failure was not just in making the calf. It was in abandoning his calling. He was supposed to be a priest, a spiritual leader, a mediator between God and the people. Instead, he became an enabler of their rebellion. His responsibility was to uphold truth even when the people resisted it, to guard the sanctity of their relationship with God. But under pressure, He chose popularity over principle. And what followed was a celebration that spiraled into chaos. The people rose early the next day, offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the idol, and then sat down to eat and drink. They rose up to play, a phrase that suggests far more than innocent festivity. It implies revelry, unrestrained behavior, a descent into the kind of moral disorder that always follows when God is replaced by human invention. Aaron might have thought he was buying time, managing a crisis, preventing panic, but in doing so, he legitimized rebellion. His hands shaped the object, but his silence shaped the outcome. He did not correct them, he did not stop them, and his failure would not be forgotten. The spiritual consequences ran deep. This was not a minor error. It was a breaking of the very command they had just received. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. And Aaron, the high priest, violated both. What this reveals is unsettling. Even those closest to the truth can fall. Even leaders with sacred callings can compromise. And sometimes the most dangerous decisions come not from outright defiance, but from subtle surrender. Aaron did not shout rebellion. He simply yielded when he should have stood. Far above the noise of celebration and dancing, in a realm untouched by the confusion below, Moses stood in communion with God. What was being forged atop the mountain was not only law but relationship, not merely rules but a framework for holiness. The presence of God surrounded him, instructing him in the construction of a sanctuary, a dwelling place among the people, so that the same glory that filled Sinai could one day rest in their midst. It was sacred, weighty, and full of promise. But in the midst of that divine exchange, the tone suddenly shifted. God, whose words had been full of detail and design, spoke with a piercing interruption. Go down at once, for your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way I commanded them. What followed was not merely a report, but a judgment. They have made for themselves a golden calf, bowed to it, sacrificed to it, and declared, "These are your gods, O Israel." The betrayal was not only an offense against God's law. It was a rupture in the relationship he had initiated with love and power. He had delivered them, carried them on eagle's wings, drawn them near to himself, spoken to them as no nation had ever heard. And in a matter of days, they had discarded him, not forgotten, but replaced, not misunderstood, but openly rebelled. This was not ignorance. This was willful corruption. And now, the voice that once thundered with revelation roared with wrath. The declaration was terrifying in its clarity. Let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and that I may consume them. God was not issuing a warning. He was presenting a verdict. The fire on the mountain was no longer just a sign of majesty. It had become the expression of divine fury. He who had stretched out his hand to save was now ready to stretch it out to destroy. Not a portion of the people, not a handful of rebels. The entire nation. This was not an emotional outburst. It was justice. God had every right to wipe them out. He had spoken. They had agreed. The covenant had been ratified. And now they had broken it in the most flagrant way possible. In human terms, it would be like breaking a marriage vow before the wedding feast had even ended. And God, in His holiness, could not overlook such treachery. The seriousness of idolatry cannot be overstated. It is not merely a lapse in theology. It is a declaration of independence from the Creator. It says, we no longer need you to define us, guide us, or protect us. We will shape our own gods. We will set our own boundaries. And in doing so, we reject not just God's commands, but His very being. This is what provoked the divine anger. Not just that the people had made a golden calf, but that they had claimed it as the source of their deliverance. They rewrote their history in real time. What God had done, they now attributed to metal. What He had spoken, they now ignored. In the language of covenant, it was a breach worthy of death. And yet, in the midst of this fury, God spoke to Moses with a strange offer: "I will make of you a great nation." It was a repetition of the promise once given to Abraham. The seed of blessing could continue through Moses alone. The covenant would not fail, it would simply be rerooted. Justice would be preserved, righteousness upheld. Israel would perish, but the plan would live on. It was a moment of divine testing, but also of revealed character. The wrath of God is not random, it is not cruel. It is the necessary response of holiness to sin. A God who does not burn with anger against wickedness is not good. A God who tolerates rebellion without consequence is not just. What we see on Sinai is the terrifying beauty of a God who is pure and whose purity cannot be contaminated. Psalm 5 verse 4 declares, "For you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you." But alongside His holiness, we also begin to see the tension that pulses through the heart of divine judgment. For as much as God is ready to destroy, He also chooses to reveal His intentions to Moses. He does not act in secret. He invites the prophet into the knowledge of what is to come. And in that invitation, we catch a glimpse of patience hiding beneath the fire. God could have consumed them without warning, without discussion. But He speaks to Moses. He names the sin. He describes the betrayal. And then He waits. This is not weakness. It is divine restraint. The same fire that could destroy is held back, if only for a moment, to make room for something else: intercession. But that story belongs to what comes next. It could have ended right there. One word from God and the nation of Israel would have been reduced to ash, their memory swallowed by the wilderness they once crossed with songs of victory. The fire of divine wrath was not poetic, it was real, ready, and entirely justified. Yet between that holy anger and the guilty people stood one man, not with weapons or wealth, but with words. Moses did not retreat in fear, nor accept the offer to become the founder of a new nation. He chose instead to plead, to intercede, to stand in the space where judgment hovered and cry out for mercy. This was not negotiation, it was not manipulation. It was intercession, born from love and shaped by loyalty. Moses began not with excuses for the people, but with a direct appeal to the character of God. "Why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand?" His question was bold, but not disrespectful. It was rooted in the truth that these were God's people first, that their deliverance had been an act of divine grace, not human merit. By reminding God of His own actions, Moses was not informing Him of something forgotten, but aligning his prayer with the narrative God Himself had begun. Then came the appeal to God's reputation. Why should the Egyptians say, "He brought them out with evil intent, to kill them in the mountains and wipe them from the face of the earth"? This was not about saving face. It was about the witness of God's name among the nations. If the chosen people were destroyed after being delivered, what would that say about the one who delivered them? Would the world see justice or cruelty? Would they revere Him or mock Him? Moses was not concerned with appearances, but with the integrity of God's revelation to the world. Finally, he reached back to the covenant itself, invoking the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. "Remember your servants," he prayed, "and the oath you swore to them." He reminded God of the stars, the sand, the innumerable descendants promised. These were not empty words. They were the foundation of everything that had happened so far. Moses was holding God to His own word, not out of presumption, but out of faith in its reliability. What happened next is one of the most astonishing moments in all of Scripture. "And the Lord relented from the disaster He had spoken of bringing on His people." The omnipotent God, holy and just, responded to the cry of one man. The prayer of Moses did not change God's nature, but it did engage with it. Mercy, already part of God's character, was awakened by the voice of a servant willing to carry the burden of a nation's sin. This moment speaks volumes about the power of intercession. It is not passive. It is not pleading from a place of despair. It is the act of standing between what is deserved and what could be, between wrath and redemption. It takes courage, not only to approach God, but to do so on behalf of those who have failed. Moses did not excuse their idolatry. He did not downplay their guilt. He simply asked for another chance, another breath, another day. And in doing so, he revealed something essential about spiritual leadership. To lead God's people is not merely to organize, instruct, or manage. It is to carry their failures as your own. It is to weep over their sins. It is to feel the weight of their choices, even when you did not make them. True leaders do not run from the fire. They step into it, not to feed the flames, but to seek the hand that can quench them. What Moses did on that mountain was not just heroic. It was prophetic. It pointed forward to a greater intercessor, one who would not only plead for mercy, but become the means by which it could be granted. Yet even in this ancient moment, we are reminded that prayer is not weak. It is warfare. It is standing in the gap where no one else will stand. And sometimes, as this moment proves, it is the very thing that holds back the flood of destruction. The climb down from Mount Sinai was not a descent of triumph. It was a return marked by gravity, a prophet carrying in his arms the very words of God, etched in stone by the divine hand. These tablets were not symbolic, they were sacred, the physical representation of a covenant meant to shape a nation's soul. Each word engraved by fire was pure, perfect, and binding. Moses did not come down the mountain as a man bringing advice, but as one bearing the laws of a holy God, laws intended to turn slaves into a kingdom of priests. Joshua, waiting partway down the mountain, heard the noise rising from the camp. He mistook it at first for the sound of battle, perhaps thinking an enemy had attacked while they were away. But Moses, with a heavy voice and a deeper understanding of what sin sounds like, corrected him. It is not the sound of victory or defeat, it is the sound of singing, but not the kind that pleases the Lord. It was celebration without reverence, joy without truth, a festival built around a lie. That kind of music, no matter how lively, cannot hide rebellion. As the base of the mountain came into view, the scene unfolded in full, the golden calf gleaming in the sunlight, the people dancing wildly, voices lifted not in praise, but in distorted imitation of worship. What Moses saw was not just a failure of obedience, but a collapse of identity. These were the people who had heard the voice of God, who had agreed to follow his commandments. And now, not weeks later, they were bowing before a lifeless statue, claiming it as their savior. It was more than disappointment. It was devastation. And then, in one of the most unforgettable moments in biblical history, Moses hurled the tablets to the ground. The shattering of those stones was not a loss of temper. It was a prophetic act, a visible declaration that the covenant had been broken, not by God, but by his people. What had been carved by divine fingers was now in fragments, just as their loyalty lay in pieces. The sound of cracking stone echoed the reality of their betrayal. It was not Moses' covenant to preserve. It was theirs to keep, and they had shattered it with their idolatry. What followed was not silence, but confrontation. Moses turned to Aaron, his own brother, and demanded an explanation. What did these people do to you, that you led them into such great sin? The question pierced more than Aaron's actions. It exposed his failure to lead. His response was weak, evasive, almost absurd. He claimed the people were set on evil, that they gave him gold. And then, as if by magic, the calf came out. But Moses knew better. Aaron had not simply followed, he had facilitated. He had shaped the idol with his own hands. And now he tried to dodge the weight of responsibility. Leadership without conviction leads to ruin. Aaron's fear of the people had made him complicit in their fall. And Moses, though grieved, did not soften the truth. Then came the burning of the calf. Moses ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the people drink it. It was not revenge, it was a declaration. The idol they had worshipped would be destroyed, consumed, made into nothing. What they had elevated would be brought to dust, and by drinking it, they would taste the bitterness of their own rebellion, a symbolic act that underscored the futility and shame of what they had done. Chaos had taken root in the camp. The boundaries between holiness and profanity had blurred. What was once a gathering of the redeemed had become a scene of disgrace. And Moses, the one who had pleaded for their lives, now stood among them as a witness to their descent. His anger was not uncontrolled fury. It was righteous indignation, the kind that burns not for personal offense, but for the desecration of something sacred. It was the heartbreak of a leader who had seen the face of God, only to return and find that the people had forgotten him. This was not a moment that could be dismissed or repaired with quick words. It was a spiritual crisis, and it demanded a reckoning. In the wake of shattered tablets and smoldering idol dust, the silence that hung over the camp was not peace, it was paralysis. The people stood stunned, the echoes of their laughter now ghosts in the air, replaced by the weight of shame and confusion. Their dance had ended, but the consequences had only begun. Moses, eyes burning not only with anger but with a grief deeper than words, stood before them, calling out, not to accuse, not to debate, but to draw a line that could no longer be blurred. Whoever is on the Lord's side, come to me. It was not a question. It was a summons, a call that cut through the crowd like a blade through cloth. There was no room left for neutrality, no space for silent loyalty or private regret. This was a moment of allegiance, and it was the sons of Levi who answered. They stepped forward not just as family to Moses, but as men willing to stand for the holiness of God, even when that stand would require more than courage. It would demand obedience to a command that defied every human instinct. Take your swords, Moses said, and go back and forth through the camp, each of you killing your brother and friend and neighbor. The order was as clear as it was brutal. It is tempting to soften this moment, to interpret it symbolically, to explain it away as an act of ancient severity no longer relevant. But the text does not allow for such distance. What happened that day was bloodshed, real, personal, unavoidable. 3,000 men fell by the swords of their own kin. Not strangers, not enemies, brothers, friends, neighbors. The kind of judgment that cannot be rationalized away, but must be understood through the lens of divine holiness. This was not vengeance. It was purification. Idolatry had not merely crept into the camp, it had taken center stage. It had been celebrated, defended, normalized. The covenant had been broken in public, and public sin requires public reckoning. The Levites, by acting in obedience to God through Moses, became the instruments through which a line was drawn once more. They were not eager executioners. They were men compelled by loyalty, not emotion. To them, obedience cost everything. And yet, they obeyed. What made this act even more severe was its intimacy. Killing an enemy in war is one thing, but this was a purging among their own people. Each swing of the sword would have been against someone they knew, someone whose voice they had heard, whose face they had recognized. The horror of it was not in its violence alone, but in its nearness. Divine justice had come not from outside the camp, but from within. And yet, out of this act came something unexpected. Moses declared that the Levites had set themselves apart, consecrated themselves to the Lord. Their actions, though unthinkable by human standards, marked them as a tribe chosen for service. It was not the sword that made them holy, but their submission to the command of the Most High when others hesitated. In a moment of spiritual collapse, they chose faithfulness, and it shaped their destiny. This chapter of Israel's history remains one of its darkest, not because God delighted in judgment, but because holiness demanded it. The golden calf was not just a mistake, it was rebellion against the very foundation of their identity. And rebellion, when unaddressed, spreads like a disease. Justice was not the absence of mercy. It was the necessary cost of restoring order, of rebuilding what had been desecrated. This scene reminds us that loyalty to God cannot always coexist with comfort. Sometimes it demands painful separations, difficult decisions, and unwavering trust in the one who sees what we cannot. The Levites did not act with malice. They acted with solemn resolve, knowing that obedience, in this moment, would leave scars. When the dust began to settle and the cries from the purging faded into an eerie quiet, the camp of Israel found itself no longer in a state of celebration or chaos, but in a kind of stunned mourning. The idol was gone, the guilty had been punished, and the golden calf lay as powder scattered in the stream. Yet something lingered. The atmosphere had changed, not only in the air around them but in the hearts within them. Shame had replaced laughter. Reverence had returned, but it was heavy, laced with sorrow and fear. They had seen the cost of rebellion, but they were not yet free from its grip. Forgiveness is not the absence of consequence. Mercy, even when extended, does not erase the impact of what has been done. That truth was about to become painfully clear. For just when it seemed that judgment had run its course, another blow fell, not from man, not by the sword, but from God Himself. A plague came upon the people, a final stroke of justice that no one could deflect or contain. It swept through the camp not with fire or thunder, but with quiet, invisible force, a divine sickness that spoke louder than words. Why another act of judgment? Had they not suffered enough? Had not the prayers been offered, the idol destroyed, the rebels struck down? Why was there still more to endure? Because holiness cannot be negotiated. The golden calf was not simply an external failure. It was a spiritual infection. Its roots reached into the identity of the people, into their assumptions, their longings, their patterns of belief. It revealed a heart condition that could not be cut out with a sword alone. What the Levites had done was severe, but it addressed only the outward rebellion. The plague was God's answer to what lay beneath. It was not mindless destruction. It was purification, driven by a justice that sees what no human eye can perceive. Sign, even when confessed, leaves traces. It alters the soil in which trust must grow again. Forgiveness reopens the path to relationship, but healing that relationship takes time and often pain. The plague was not proof that God had turned away. It was evidence that He had not. If He had abandoned them, no discipline would have followed, only silence. But discipline is the act of a father who still claims his children. It is His refusal to let them walk away without understanding what they have done. This moment stands as a testament to the seriousness of divine presence. God was not building a casual relationship with Israel. He was shaping a holy people, a nation through whom His glory would shine to the world. Such a calling could not coexist with unresolved rebellion. The covenant they had entered into was not optional. It carried weight, and every act against it had a cost. Even when mercy was given, holiness demanded that the people feel the gravity of their betrayal. The plague became a scar on their history, a mark that would remind future generations that idolatry is not harmless, that dancing around a calf can lead to death. And yet, it also marked the point where judgment gave way to renewal. After the plague, something shifted. The people were no longer defiant. Their hearts were humbled, their eyes opened. The silence that followed was not empty, it was sacred. Like the stillness after a storm that has torn through everything false and left only what is real. This was not the end, but it was the necessary low point in a story of restoration. Sometimes before healing can begin, the wound must be exposed completely. And sometimes, the last blow of judgment is what makes room for the first breath of grace. In the quiet aftermath, once the sword had been sheathed and the plague had taken its toll, the people might have hoped that the worst was over. Their camp bore the marks of judgment, losses measured in lives and sorrow, but what remained was still intact. The tent stood, the mountain loomed. The morning manna still fell. Yet when Moses entered once more into communion with God, what he heard was not comfort, not reassurance, but a verdict even heavier than the ones before. "Go up from here," he said. "Take the people whom you brought out of Egypt and go to the land I promised. I will send an angel before you." but I will not go up among you." The words struck like cold wind against a bruised soul. This was not exile. It was something worse, permission to proceed without presence. The land would still be theirs. The promise remained intact. But the God who had split seas and spoken from fire would no longer walk among them. He would give them blessing, but not himself. It was the kind of arrangement many might find acceptable. Safety, provision, progress, all guaranteed. But without the presence of the one who had defined them, what remained would be hollow. The people, once terrified by God's nearness, now realized what life without him would mean. The thought of milk and honey no longer satisfied when the voice that had once thundered above Sinai threatened silence. Moses, bearing the weight of this revelation, did not settle for what was offered. His heart, shaped by intimacy with the divine, could not accept a journey without the guide. He went again before God, this time not to plead for mercy from wrath, but for nearness in mercy. "If your presence does not go with us, do not bring us up from here." It was not a demand, it was desperation. What good is the promised land if the promiser is not with us? What value is a destination if it is traveled in divine absence? This was the dilemma at the heart of the covenant. Mercy had preserved them, but justice still burned. Could God dwell among a people so prone to rebellion without compromising his holiness? Could he be near to them and not consume them? The dilemma was not about punishment, it was about presence. Holiness cannot dwell among the unholy without purification. Yet mercy longs to be near, to restore, to lead again. The relationship between God and Israel hung in the balance, not by force, but by choice. Would God distance himself to preserve his holiness? Or would he draw near and risk the unfaithfulness of a people whose hearts had already turned once? The question was not theoretical. It was real, tangible, felt in the silence between words, in the tension between mountain and camp. Moses stood once more as the intercessor, not simply as a prophet or leader, but as a friend of God, one who had seen his glory and could not bear to walk without it. His plea was not rooted in strategy, but in love. He did not ask for protection, for conquest, or for favor. He asked for God. That was the heart of intercession, yearning not for the gifts, but for the giver. Not every turning point is marked by thunder or fire. Some unfold in the quiet relocation of a simple tent, pitched not among the crowds, but outside the camp's borders, away from the noise of daily movement and from the very place where rebellion had defiled sacred space. This tent, ordinary in its materials, but extraordinary in its purpose, became the meeting place where Moses would seek the presence of God. It was not the tabernacle, not yet the structured, ordained dwelling God had described. It was in its essence a declaration, "We still need you." Each time Moses walked toward it, the people would rise and stand at the entrances of their tents, watching in silence. They had seen what disobedience could cost. They had tasted judgment and watched the weight of their sin nearly sever their covenant. Now they witnessed something different, a man who would not be content with distance. The cloud would descend, the presence of the Lord would settle, and Moses would speak to God as one speaks to a friend. This was not ritual. It was relationship. The tent of meeting was not established to showcase Moses' spirituality. It was not a symbol to remind the people of what they had lost. It was a space carved out of failure and shaped by hunger, a hunger to reconnect, to restore, to rebuild what sin had fractured. It stood as a visible expression of the invisible longing for intimacy, a place where words could rise from a scarred soul and still be received. God spoke with Moses there not in cryptic signs or distant commands, but face to face. The phrase does not suggest equality, but immediacy. It means that in that tent, the barrier of heaven and earth thinned, and a man stood in the glow of glory, not as one crushed by shame, but as one welcomed in grace. It was not that Moses was perfect. It was that he was willing to draw near again, even when others remained still. Willing to speak with God when the memory of judgment still lingered in the camp. What took shape in that tent would set the tone for Israel's future. Not because it restored everything instantly, but because it opened a path forward. Intimacy with God had not been destroyed, it had been wounded. And wounds, while painful, can heal if touched with truth. The tent became that place of healing. Not for the nation all at once, but through one man who stood in their place, again and again. And as Joshua lingered near, remaining even after Moses departed, we glimpse the legacy such communion leaves. The presence of God, once feared as unapproachable, became again something to seek, to dwell near, to rest within. The tent did not erase the past, but it refused to let the past be the final word. In the stillness of the tent, where God met man without spectacle, without the trembling of earth or the crackling of fire, something rose within Moses that could not be silenced. It was not born of ambition or curiosity, nor was it driven by fear or desperation. It was hunger, pure, unfiltered longing for more. Moses had heard the voice, stood in the cloud, watched the Red Sea part, seen miracles unfold like pages of a divine book. He had spoken with God face to face, and yet that was not enough. Not for a heart awakened to the beauty of holiness. Not for a soul that had tasted glory and now craved the fullness of it. So he said, "Show me your glory." It was a request that defied logic. Moses had already seen more than any man alive. He had watched plagues obey divine command, seen water gush from stone, walked through walls of water, and lingered on the mountain where God descended. But spiritual hunger does not measure satisfaction in volume. It only deepens with each encounter. What Moses asked for was not more miracles. He did not ask for strength, victory, or wisdom. He asked to see the essence of who God was. Not just power, but presence. Not just nearness, but nature. In that moment, he was asking to be drawn into the very heart of the divine. And God responded, not with rejection, not with rebuke, but with something infinitely tender and profoundly mysterious. "I will make all my goodness pass before you." What an answer! Not might, not wrath, not even glory in the form Moses might have expected, but goodness. Because at the core of who God is, beyond judgment, beyond holiness, beyond even the fire and thunder, there's a radiant, unshakable goodness that defines everything he does. And it was this that Moses would be allowed to see. Yet even that vision required protection. No man can see me and live. The fullness of God's glory, unveiled and unrestricted, would be more than mortal flesh could bear. So God offered a way. He would place Moses in the cleft of a rock, shield him with his hand, and allow him to see the trailing edge of glory, the afterglow of divinity passing by. It was not a refusal. It was mercy shaping the encounter, allowing a glimpse without overwhelming the one who sought it. This request, made in the aftermath of rebellion, casts a piercing contrast against the golden calf. Where the people had wanted a God they could control, mold, and understand, Moses longed for a God who could not be grasped. The idol was shaped by human hands. The glory Moses pursued could only be revealed by divine will. The people settled for spectacle. Moses reached for substance. The calf had been a symbol of regression, a step backward into the comfort of visible gods. But Moses' plea was the opposite. It was a reach forward, upward, into mystery. He did not want what was easy to explain. He wanted what was real, even if it could not be fully seen. This is the heart of spiritual hunger. It does not rest in what has been experienced. It is not satisfied with second-hand encounters. It keeps asking, keeps seeking, not because it is restless, but because it is drawn by the infinite. And to such a heart, God does not remain distant. He may not always show the fullness of his glory, but he will reveal his goodness. He will pass by in ways that change everything, not by storm, but by whisper, not by spectacle, but by presence. No shattered stone lay forgotten at the foot of Sinai. Every fragment of the first tablets remained a witness to what had been broken. Divine words given in fire, cast down in grief, split by the weight of rebellion. But God was not finished. The covenant may have cracked, but the hands that once wrote it had not withdrawn. What had been destroyed in righteous anger would be rewritten in enduring mercy. The command came quietly, but unmistakably. Cut for yourself 2 tablets of stone like the first. God did not summon angels to shape them. He did not descend again in thunder to deliver new laws from scratch. He asked Moses to bring the stone, while he would bring the words. It was a partnership not of equals, but of grace and participation. Moses, the intercessor, would now also be the carrier once more. The covenant would be rewritten not because the people had earned it, but because God had chosen not to let them go. Early in the morning, Moses ascended Sinai again. This time, he carried no broken pieces, only hope in the form of blank stone. The climb was not rushed. It was deliberate, the journey of a man who had stood in the breach and found that mercy still spoke. And at the top, the Lord descended in the cloud, stood with him, and proclaimed his name, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. These were not abstract virtues. They were the very qualities that had held back the fire, that had spoken instead of silence, that had chosen restoration over rejection. Forgiveness does not deny the truth, it overwhelms it with love. The God who had every right to abandon now revealed himself as the one who binds wounds, who reestablishes what sin tried to erase. And the new tablets, they were not a backup plan. They were not lesser than the first. They were a testament that grace does not merely overlook failure, it rebuilds what was lost. Every word etched into the stone was familiar, unchanged in its demand, but now richer in its context. These commands came not just from the heights of divine authority, but from the depths of divine patience. The people had not climbed the mountain. They had not heard the name again for themselves. But when Moses returned, carrying the law once more, he brought with him more than stone. He brought the evidence of a second chance. This was not restoration by forgetting. It was restoration through remembrance, through the holy rewriting of a covenant that still stood, not because of Israel's worthiness, but because of God's unshakable faithfulness. What was broken had not been discarded. It had been made new on the same mountain, by the same God, for the same people who had once turned away. The golden calf was not simply a historical incident tucked into the pages of ancient scripture. It was, and still is, a mirror. A story that continues to echo through generations, not only because of its drama or tragedy, but because it reveals something essential about the human heart. At its core, it exposes our tendency to drift when we are unsure, to trade what is eternal for what is immediate, to carve gods of gold when we do not trust the silence of heaven. Yet even more deeply, it reveals the relentless mercy of a holy God who refuses to abandon his people even after they have abandoned him. From the ashes of idolatry came not only judgment, but invitation. Each chapter of this story bleeds with meaning. The terrifying descent of Moses, the shattering of tablets, the sword of justice, the invisible weight of a plague. Every step paints a picture of what happens when a chosen people forget the one who chose them. And yet, what remains is not only their failure, but God's faithfulness. He did not erase them. He restored them. This is the lesson that lingers. We are reminded that spiritual leadership is not a title, but a burden carried in love. Moses, standing in the gap again and again, becomes a portrait of what it means to intercede, to plead for mercy when wrath is deserved, to seek God's glory even after betrayal. We are also confronted with the sobering truth that God's presence is not to be taken lightly. It is holy, it is consuming, but it is also deeply personal and profoundly intimate to those who seek Him with sincerity. The Levite's sword draws a hard line through the cost of compromise. The plague reminds us that sin leaves marks, even when forgiveness comes. And yet, the tent of meeting rises outside the camp to show that intimacy is still possible. The hunger of Moses, captured in his daring request to see God's glory, becomes a call for every soul that refuses to settle for religion without relationship. And in the end, the new tablets, a gift written by God's own hand, become a symbol of what grace really looks like, not overlooking sin, but renewing covenant after the ruin, not abandoning the broken, but rebuilding on the very mountain where failure once stood. So what then is the enduring lesson from the golden calf? That idolatry always begins with a misplaced longing. That true leadership walks into fire, not away from it. That judgment and mercy are not opposites, but partners in the hands of a holy God. And above all, that no failure is final when grace decides to right again. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most sobering and powerful chapters in the history of God's people. If this message spoke to your heart, if it made you reflect or stirred something within you, we invite you to subscribe to the channel. Like the video to help it reach more people. Leave a comment to share your thoughts or questions. And please pass it on to someone who may need to hear this message today. Let the lessons of the golden calf not end with you. Share the truth and keep the light alive.